All right, so let's go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning. Want to welcome this 018. My name is Paul Savoy, and just to make sure that we're all properly oriented, especially myself, it is Tuesday, the 28th day of April 2020. I am losing track of days like nobody's business. So I always want to start out every meeting with that just to make sure I know where I am. So this morning, we're going to do several things. First of all, we're going to go ahead and talk about a couple of important reminders about the class, some logistical information, particularly if you want to go ahead and talk to me in various ways virtually during the semester. Then I'll go ahead and go over the logistics, the process, the details regarding test number 2, which you are all working on right now. And once I go over that, I will be happy to take any questions that you have about any of the actual information, the actual content that is covered by test number 2. And if we want to take the entire time today doing that, I'm happy to do so. Then with any time that we have left over, I will go ahead and preview, first of all, the next major unit of information that we're going to be getting into once we get past test number 2, pretty much what we're going to be doing for the next 3 weeks, talking a little bit about the changing relationship amongst the 3 national government branches in the United States: Congress, the folks who make the laws, the president, and the rest of the executive branch who are enforcing national government laws, as well as the courts, the judicial branch, whose main job is to interpret national government laws to tell us what those laws actually mean. So I'll kind of preview that general unit and then more specifically go over some of the notes that I posted for you this morning on our modules page on Canvas. I opened up the Congress module and posted the notes. And just so you know, a little bit later on today, after we get wrapped up here, I will go ahead and post the 2 crash course videos for Congress, as well as post the discussion forum assignment for Congress, which will be due not this Thursday, but a week from this coming Thursday, which is May 7th. So that is pretty much what we'll be dealing with in class virtually this morning. Just a couple of reminders, though, going forward. First of all, as always, this meeting is being recorded so that sometime between 12 and 24 hours after we wrap up the meeting today, you'll be able to access the full recording of this meeting via the ConferZoom link on the left-hand side, the menu side of our Canvas homepage. Click on the ConferZoom link, click on recordings, then click on the link for this meeting, and you will probably be prompted to submit the password that I gave you for this meeting, and you can access the full recording, look at as much or as little of it as you want, whenever you want. So yeah, this is being recorded as always. So before we do anything else, any general questions, comments, problems, etc., associated with anything having to do with this class? And throughout our meeting today, if you have a question or a comment, please do feel free to open up your mic, ask your question, make your comment, or if you'd rather, go ahead and put that question or comment in the group chat, and I'll respond to it from there. So anything at all generally having to do with the class before we go ahead and get started for this morning? Anybody? Okay, well, very good. So let me just give you a couple of quick reminders dealing with the class, especially in terms of communicating with me. Of course, you know, anytime you need to talk to me either about anything having to do with an assignment or the class in general or anything else, you know, dealing with LBCC or your life outside of LBCC that you think I might be able to help you with, please don't hesitate. I am here for you for all of this. And so, of course, you can always send me an email or a Canvas message. Remember, though, you can also meet with me one-on-one via Zoom through my twice weekly online student hours. Remember, those student hours are every Monday and Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 until 3:30. That's Pacific Daylight Time. And you can access those virtual student hours. You can access the Zoom link for them and the password that you need for them by going on to the Canvas homepage for this class, scrolling down past the picture to where it says basic course information. The Zoom link for virtual student hours and the password are there for you. Please feel free to use them. And remember, during the virtual student hours, I'm not lecturing, doing what I do during our weekly Zoom class meetings, but instead, anything that you would normally have come to see me about during my, regular on-campus student hours back when we were still face-to-face at LAC, please feel free to come and chat with me via the virtual student hours. And remember, when you log on to those virtual student hours, you will be first placed into a virtual waiting room because everything's virtual on Zoom, right? And as soon as I am done working with whatever student I am working with, I will bring you in from the waiting room. We can go ahead and chat and do what we need to do. Also, if you have other commitments, other classes, anything else that prevents you from doing the virtual student hours and you still want to meet with me one-on-one via Zoom, we can still do that. Please let me know via Canvas message or email, and we can work out a time, an appointment time where we can do a one-on-one chat on Zoom as well. So please, please, please do not hesitate to contact me for anything that you think that I can help you out with, all right, going forward. So what else do we want to accomplish today? Well, obviously, the next thing that we should talk about is test number 2. That is the assignment that you are currently working on for this class. And I talked a little bit about this last week, but I do want to mention it again today. First of all, if you haven't yet found test number 2, go to the assignments tab on the left-hand menu on our Canvas class homepage, click on assignments, then scroll down to where it says test number 2, click on that link. It takes you directly there. And as you see, when you open up that link, you will see that the format for test number 2 is pretty much the exact same for 2 basic exceptions that I'll talk about. So part 1 of the test is the short answer section, just like test number 1 that we took face-to-face back towards the early part of the semester. There are 22 terms listed there in part 1 of test number 2, all terms that we have worked with, that we have learned about since test number 1, because remember, the tests in this class are not cumulative, even now that we are solely online. So there are concepts stemming from our discussion of public opinion, mass media, political parties, interest groups, as well as campaigns and elections. So go through those 22 terms, pick the 8 terms that you think you can do the best job answering, and in about 3 to 4 complete sentences each, you're giving me a basic definition for each term. You're also telling me why that term is significant, why it's important. You're kind of making connections between that particular concept and other stuff that we are talking about in the class. You're trying to kind of give me context to help me know that you don't just understand the basic definition of the term, but you understand kind of where it fits as well. So you're doing that for 8 of the terms out of the 22. Each of those responses is worth a maximum of 7.5 points for a maximum possible point total of 60 points in part 1 of the test. Then, if you scroll down to part 2, that is the mini essay section. And this test, I give you 4 potential mini essay questions that you can respond to. So obviously read through those 4 questions, choose the one that you can do the best job of answering, and provide me with a response to that question in about 5 paragraphs. It might go a little bit below 5 paragraphs. It might go a little bit above. 5 paragraphs is kind of the general goal that you want to shoot for. and make sure that your answer responds to all elements of the question, because remember, my essay questions always have like 2 or 3 related parts to them. Your approximately 5-paragraph response to that question is worth the remaining 40 points possible for the test. Now, remember the 2 differences between test number 2, which you're working on now, and test number 1 from earlier in the semester. This test and test number 3 at the end of the semester are completely open book, open note, open video, all that kind of thing. So please feel free as you're working on test number 2 to refer to any resources that will help you answer the questions. So any of our assigned readings, any of the class notes that I've given you from Canvas, any of the crash course or other videos that I've required you to take a look at, please feel free to refer to all that stuff as much as you want to. Also, there is no time limit. So, when you're working on the test, as long as you submit the test by the due date or within that 3-day grace period after the due date, that is fine. We're not going to use Proctorio or anything like that. So you have to log in, start taking the test, and you have 85 minutes from when you log in, and your camera is on and you're being watched the whole time to make sure you're not cheating. Not doing any of that stuff. So open book, open note, no time limit. And again, unlike test number 1, you do not need to give me an essay outline for your part 2 essay. Since it's open book and open note and not timed, there's really no point for it. So that is how test number 2 is working. And remember, 2 ways for you to submit test number 2 to me, both via Canvas. When you're in the actual assignment on Canvas for test number 2, at the very top in the right-hand side, there will be a button that says submit test or something like that. And there are 2 ways that you can do it. You can either submit your answers to me via a text box that Canvas will provide for you. You can either directly type your answers into that text box and submit it, or if you'd rather, you can, do your answers in a separate Microsoft Word file or something like that, and then cut and paste the whole thing into the text box and submit it that way. Or if you'd rather, you can submit your answers to me via one of 3 different file formats. You can either submit the test answers to me as a doc format, a docx format, or a PDF format. Please do not use any other format to submit your test answers. So no Google Docs, please. And please submit your answers to me through Canvas. Do not send me an email with an attached file of any kind. Please submit it through Canvas. And if you have any trouble submitting it through Canvas, please send me an email or a Canvas message and let me know. All right. So that is all the logistical details, all of the process details for test number 2. Any questions, comments, problems about any of that stuff relating to test number 2 itself?
Yeah, I have a question about the first part. So on the second part last time, I quoted from your notes. Would you prefer if we didn't quote from your notes in the first part since it is so short?
It doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously, the definition of the term is the definition of the term. So if you give me pretty much a word for word definition in part 1, that's fine. And you don't have to say, taken from your class notes. I can figure that out. I'll assume that. The one thing that I would like to hear kind of your own words on, though, in part 1 has to do with the significance of the term. So that you can kind of get, so I know that kind of how the term relates, how it connects, that sort of thing. But as far as the actual definition, that's fine. Word for word from the notes doesn't really bother me all that much. All right?
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about the logistics, the details, the process for test number 2? Anybody? Okay. So at this point, let me open it up a little bit further. So are there any questions at this stage about any of the concepts, any of the actual information that is being covered by test number 2? Obviously, I won't give you the answers to the essay questions or anything like that, but if you need for me to clarify a concept, a piece of information that's covered on the test, I would be happy to do so right now. So any content questions relating to test number 2 at this point? And I'll give you a minute to think about it. And I'll just stare at you. Okay, so if content questions come up, or if any questions come up regarding test number 2 between now and when you turn it in via Canvas, please feel free. Send me a Canvas message, send me an email, stop by during my virtual student hours tomorrow afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30. Do whatever you need to do to get your questions answered, and I will be happy to help you out. All right. Okay, so what we want to do then, what we want to spend the rest of our time together this morning talking about is giving you a bit of a preview to where we are going next as we are working through moving past test number 2. So the next sort of major unit or section of information that we'll be covering after we get done with test number 2 is we will be doing a rather in-depth examination of the 3 national government branches, the 3 main governmental institutions within the national government structure. So next week, we'll be focusing specifically on Congress, otherwise known as the legislative branch, the folks who are responsible for making national government laws. Then the week after that, we'll talk a little bit, actually more than a little bit, about the presidency and the rest of the executive branch that are responsible, among other things, for enforcing national government laws. And then finally, we'll take an in-depth look the week after that at the judicial branch, the federal court system, and their main responsibility, which is to interpret national government laws, to tell us what those laws actually mean in practice. And so first thing I want to do is kind of orient you as to why we're talking about the 3 national government branches now at this stage of the semester, and then to kind of give you the broad overview of what I want you to keep in mind over the next several weeks as we discuss first Congress and the courts. As the doorbell rings and my dog goes crazy, Congress, the president, and he's a good watchdog, as you can tell. Anyway, so I'll give you kind of the broad overview of what is going on. Unfortunately, my virtual office is right next to the front door, so, you know, it kind of complicates things a little bit sometimes. But anyway, I'll give you the broad overview as to why we're talking about the 3 branches at this stage, and then I will go ahead and give you an overview of the notes that we are dealing with Congress. I posted those notes. I opened up the Congress module on our Canvas page this morning, put the notes up, and as I said earlier, later today, put the rest of the stuff up that you need for Congress as well. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of our time together this morning. So first of all, why now? Why at this stage in the semester do we go ahead and talk a little bit about Congress, the president, and the courts? Well, think a little bit about where we've been so far this semester. We started off the semester back when we were still meeting face-to-face, talking a little bit about the basic foundation of our governmental system in the United States. So we talked about how we went from being 13 British colonies to 13 American states. We talked about the reasons behind the American Revolution. We talked about the Declaration of Independence. We talked about the Articles of Confederation, our first disastrous Constitution. And we talked about how all that stuff eventually leads to the creation of our current Constitution, our current political rule book, starting in 1787. And so once we figured out all that foundational stuff, we then went ahead, after we took test number one, of course, and then tried to figure out how and why and how well we as the American public are able to communicate with our elected officials in all levels of government. So we talked about, first of all, the importance of public opinion, what it is, why it matters, how we measure it. And then we talked about the four main linkage mechanisms, the four main ways that we attempt to maintain a robust, consistent flow of two-way communication back and forth between the people and the government. And, guess what? As we talked about mass media, as we talked about political parties, interest groups, as well as campaigns and elections, in preparation for test number two, chances are you were starting to figure out, maybe there's some challenges here. Maybe there are some limitations to the effectiveness of our four main linkage mechanisms now. Because remember kind of the broad question that we are examining in this section of the class. And that was, we understand that if we're going to maintain a democratic political system, that is a system where the people have the last word over what government does and how government does it, we need to have that robust, consistent two-way flow of information. But maybe, as you've been learning about our four linkage mechanisms over the past month or so, maybe you've been starting to think, maybe they're not doing everything that they need to do today. Maybe our linkage mechanisms now are not giving us the level and quality of information that we need and that our elected officials need. So, that's kind of the main thing that we're looking at now. Now, given our study of the Constitution first and our study of linkage mechanisms next, it makes sense now that the next natural step in our progression of learning is to focus our attention in understanding how the three main pieces of the national government actually work, what they're supposed to do on their own, what they're supposed to do in interaction with each other, and how they are supposed to interact with we, the people, through those four linkage mechanisms that we've already learned about, okay? Now, here's the big picture when it comes to the three national government branches. Here is kind of what I want you to think about over the next several weeks. Remember, during our early discussions of the Constitution towards the beginning of the semester, back when we were still face-to-face, remember I said that as the framers were writing our current Constitution, there were a number of problems that they were trying to work out. They had a couple of big priorities. And remember, one of those big priorities that the framers were trying to work out as they wrote our new Constitution back in the summer of 1787 was to try and figure out, okay, how do we create a system of government for the United States in which the national government is strong enough to maintain order in society, but not so strong that it threatens the people's natural rights? Hopefully that is coming back to you, being very familiar, because I kept emphasizing it a lot in the early part of the semester. Remember what we said, delicate dance here. On the one hand, the framers did not want the national government to be so strong that it could potentially abuse its power and authority, that it would end up threatening the people's natural rights in the way that the British national government did during the colonial period. So they didn't want a national government that was too strong. But at the same time, they also wanted to make sure that the national government was strong enough to be able to maintain order in society. In other words, they wanted a national government that was stronger, more effective, more useful than the national government that they were currently living under in 1787, the weak, spineless, gutless national government under our first disastrous constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So remember, we said that was one of the biggest challenges that the framers faced back during the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. How do you create a national government strong enough but not too strong? And remember what we said. The framers attempted to fulfill that priority in two major ways, right? And one of those major ways was through this thing that we call separation of powers, combined with checks and balances. Remember that? Remember what we said about separation of powers? Because it's becoming important for us now, once again, as we look in detail at Congress, the president, and the courts, and how they interact and how they've evolved over time, right? Remember what we said with separation of powers. That is when you break the national government down into its three most basic functional parts: the power to make laws, the legislative function; the power to enforce the laws, the executive function; and the power to interpret the laws, the judicial function. So you break the national government down into its three most basic component parts, and then you make sure that no one in the national government gets control over more than one of those three parts. So that's why the framers created Congress. Congress has sole authority to make national government laws. They're the legislative branch. They gave executive power solely to the president and the rest of the executive branch. They enforce national government laws. And finally, they solely give the judicial authority to the courts. They're the ones who are solely supposed to interpret the laws. And the framers hoped, the framers believed, they kind of crossed their fingers and hoped that by organizing the national government that way, that if that separation of powers could be maintained, the national government would be strong enough, but not too strong. So is that still ringing a bell with all of us? Any questions about the origins, the importance, the nature of this thing that we call separation of powers? Is that coming back to us? Any questions about that at this point? Okay. So one aspect, though, separation of powers, that I really didn't emphasize all that much early on in the semester, but I'm going to emphasize it now because now it's really relevant to what we're going to be discussing, is the fact that as the framers were building the separation of powers system into the Constitution, and as the framers were actually specifically designing each of the three national government branches, and they created Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, the President, Article 2, the courts, Article 3. As they were doing all of this, they had one fundamental assumption in mind, and that assumption was that the only way that separation of powers was going to be effective, was going to be sustainable, was going to work in the way that they needed it to work, would be if each of the three national government branches all had roughly equal levels of power and authority. So Congress, the president, and the courts all have about the same level of power within the national government system, okay? That was the starting point for the framers in designing each of these three national government branches, because they assumed, they understood quite logically, if you think about it, that if one of the branches was significantly more powerful than the other two, if there was a distinct imbalance of power amongst the three branches, separation of powers could easily break down, could easily cease to exist. And you could end up more with the sort of fusion of power system that the British government had, that the framers wanted to avoid. And so that's a really key piece for our understanding going forward, right? The framers tried to design as best they could Congress, the president, and the courts in such a way that they would all have about the same level of power, authority, influence that sort of thing. Okay. Now, that's what they tried to do. And for a pretty long time in our political history, I think that you could make the argument that they were successful. That for a pretty long time in our political history, Congress, the president, and the courts in practice in our political system really did have about equal levels of power and authority. You know, from time to time, there could be a shift a little bit with one branch or another, but for the most part, they were roughly co-equal branches. But guess what? That's not the case today. That's not the reality that we experience when we look at the national government in the year 2020. Okay. And most Americans know this. I mean, even folks who pay really not much attention to what the national government is doing most of the time, most Americans will tell us, and they do tell us in public opinion surveys and elsewhere, that today there is a significant imbalance of power within the national government. Now, let me ask you this, right? So looking at how the government is organized today and looking at the relationship amongst Congress, the president, and the courts today, which of the three national government branches would you say is by far the most powerful and influential of the three? Anybody want to take a shot at this? Yeah,
So
Ever.
I would
Sure.
assume it's probably the executive branch. And then like in the most like obvious statements that you can make is the fact that he just is able to make executive orders in like high situations, or high intensity situations, and as a result, like Congress needs to overpass like hundreds of people to get something done, right? And the same thing like at the team effort in the judicial branch, which is him. He's just like, all right, I want to do this, and like I have certain powers that lets me pass over or like pass like what Congress wants or what the court wants.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of good things in what you just said there, and I really appreciate that. So first of all, yeah, you're correct. Most Americans perceive that the president today, and it's been this way probably since the probably at least since the 1960s, the 1970s, beginning with the Watergate scandal. You hear historians and presidential scholars and other folks talk about this thing called the rise of the imperial presidency, right? And when you hear the word imperial used, it kind of makes you think like the powers of an emperor, right? And so that kind of gives you a sense as to what we're talking about here. Yeah, most people today perceive the president as being the most powerful player in the three national government branches. And one of the other things that you mentioned, Eber, in your comment that I want you to remember for when we talk about the presidency next week during this Zoom meeting is you talked about the fact that one of the tools that contemporary presidents can use to really expand their power and do things that maybe Congress doesn't want them to do, et cetera, is this thing called the executive order. And as we'll talk about next week, when we look at the presidency notes, an executive order basically is a presidential decree, a presidential command. So the president can actually issue one of these and Congress can do nothing about it. Now, the courts can overrule an executive order that they feel goes beyond the president's authority as president. But the interesting thing about these executive orders, because you're right, they are a major source of power for contemporary presidents. But the interesting thing about them is they are mentioned nowhere in the Constitution. They're not in Article 2, which describes the presidency, nowhere. So you might wonder, well, wait a minute, how can the president do something that he isn't empowered to do by the Constitution? Well, stay tuned. We'll talk about that next week, right? I'll leave you on a cliffhanger, right? Got to do that from time to time, keep you all coming back, right? So yeah, most people today say the president is by far the most powerful. And by the same token, a lot of people today say that the weakest of the three national government branches, the least effective, is Congress. Yeah, Eber, go ahead.
it kind of just had me thinking a little bit regarding, like you mentioned, like which one has the most influence. But I think it's kind of important to realize like the political parties in here, like the Republicans and stuff, because the way I see it is in Congress, the House for a while has been dominant by Republicans. Hopefully that changes, or in my personal perspective,
Well, right now the House is controlled by the Democrats. The
Democrats.
Senate's
Yeah.
controlled by Republicans. Yeah.
Right, right. But like they had some kind of power in there, and then in the court, Trump placed like his own personal judges also there to become like create an unbalance in the courts.
Mm-hmm.
Now you kind of see how like he was trying to kind of create this overarching like grand scheme of Republicans that rules essentially all three.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't just be the executive branch; it'd be like the entire governing system would be like
Right.
in the power of just Republicans. So I kind
Yeah.
of feel like that's a huge factor in trying to like
Mm-hmm.
control government and like not just limit to one person, but to the overall.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, it all in the end, it all comes back to the president, and we'll talk more about that next week. Now, the one thing that I do want to make sure is clear is that it's not just President Trump who has tried to do this, to try and get his party in control of Congress and the executive branch and over the courts, even though officially the courts are nonpartisan. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks, right? Every modern president, starting with, well, really every president going all the way back to the beginning, has tried to do that. Because if you, as president, are able to have folks from your own party have dominance in Congress and dominance in the courts, that makes it easier for you as president to completely fulfill your own agenda as president, because presumably people from your same party are going to want to help you do what you want to do. That isn't always the case. Some presidents have had revolts from their party members in Congress. One recent example was Jimmy Carter, a Democrat who was president between 1976 and 1980. Carter was a Democrat. Both houses of Congress were majority controlled by Democrats. And he had the hardest time getting Congress to do anything that he wanted for reasons that I'll share with you next week. Stay tuned, right? But yeah, so I want to get back to the larger point, though. We have this rather odd disconnect. The framers intentionally tried to create three national government branches of roughly equal power. And it was that way for a long time in our political history, but it's not that way anymore. So because of that, a couple of questions that we want to keep in mind over the next 3 weeks. One question is, first of all, is this a problem? Should we be concerned that the three branches today are significantly out of balance? Because, you know, the framers said, look, if our system's going to work the way it's supposed to, that balance needs to be maintained. And we know today it's not. Is that a problem? Or can you make the argument that there are genuine, clear, justifiable reasons why it makes more sense today in 2020 to have an unbalanced power relationship amongst the three national government branches generally? And can we argue that it makes sense in 2020 to have the dominant branch of the three specifically be the president, be the executive branch? So those are the questions I want you to keep in mind over the next several weeks, okay? And the other sort of related question is, how did this happen? If the framers took specific steps as they were creating Congress and the president and the courts in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, if they took specific steps to try and create three roughly co-equal national government branches, how did the whole system become unbalanced in the way that it is now? So those are kind of the big picture questions that I want you to keep in mind. Does that make sense? Those questions, yeah? Okay, so let me spend the last few minutes, and maybe with your indulgence, I'll go a couple minutes over, but I do want to specifically highlight a couple of things in the note set that I posted for you on Canvas this morning on the modules page, dealing specifically with what you're going to be doing this next week, dealing with the US Congress. And if you've looked at the Congress notes, man, there's a lot of them, right? So I've given you a lot of information about Congress. And so obviously in just a few minutes, I can't highlight everything, but I want to call your attention to what I think are the most important elements for you to pay attention to as you're wading through all of these notes. Now, to get back to a question that I just kind of highlighted for you in the broader sense, right? The framers, and this, if you look at the first section of your Congress notes, Roman numeral number 1, the framers, when they sat down in 1787 to create Congress, the president, and the courts, they, in their mind, already had a vision. They kind of were thinking, okay, as things stand now, we think that one branch of government, unless we're careful, has really great potential to become too powerful and abusive of its power, and others are likely going to be more weak. Now, if you look at the first section of your Congress notes, amazingly, because this goes against how we see Congress today, but when the framers sat down to create Congress in 1787, the framers assumed that Congress had the potential to become the most powerful, dangerous, and abusive of the 3 national government branches. They figured that if any branch had the potential to become too powerful and spin out of control and threaten the people's natural rights, it would be Congress. Now, obviously, that's not how we perceive Congress today, right? Most Americans today see Congress as being kind of a big joke. You know, it makes me think there are lots of jokes about Congress that are out there. I can't tell most of them here because they've got language that the dean gets mad if I use in front of students. Here's one, though, that is clean and I can use it. What is the opposite of progress? Congress, right? I know it's not very funny, but at least it's clean. And it illustrates what I'm trying to tell you right now. Most Americans today see Congress as being this weak, self-involved, kind of incompetent, kind of corrupt joke, right? Very few people today would perceive Congress as being the most powerful and potentially the most dangerous of the 3 national government branches. But the framers did. Now, the big question that I deal with in the first section of the notes in Roman numeral number 1 is, how did we get from there to here? How do we get from the framers fearing Congress, seeing Congress as the most powerful and potentially most dangerous branch, where today we see Congress as being this big, weak, inept, corrupt joke? Well, as it says in section 1 of the notes, and you can explore this in more detail when you look at it, it's the framers' fault. The framers caused Congress to evolve and change over time. How? Well, look what it says there in the first section. The framers were so afraid of Congress becoming too strong, too powerful, too abusive, that when the framers actually structured and created Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, they did so very carefully. Article 1 is the most specific and detailed part of the Constitution. The framers tried to box Congress in. In other words, the framers tried to very carefully specify in Article 1 what Congress can do and what Congress can't do, so that Congress has the power to do all the stuff that it needs to do for the good of the country, but nothing else. The framers tried to give Congress very little flexibility to be able to abuse their power. Okay? Well, guess what? As it says there in the first section of your notes, the framers did an extremely good and effective job of boxing Congress in. So much so that that's why we perceive Congress today as being weak and ineffective. The framers were too restrictive on Congress's power because they were afraid of Congress. And because they were so restrictive as to what Congress could do on its own, that's why today we perceive Congress as being weak and ineffective. So the framers were kind of overcome by their own fear of Congress. Does that make sense? Yeah. And good. So, and then the other major piece of the Congress notes that I really want you to pay attention to is section number 2, Roman numeral number 2, because here's the thing. Most of these notes on Congress, once you get to section 4, it is this big, long discussion laying out, I think pretty clearly, the 6 major functions, the 6 major jobs that the framers gave to Congress. And here's the thing, the framers kind of messed up with Congress. The framers actually gave Congress too much to do. Now, we've already said that Congress's main responsibility is to make national government laws. They're the legislative branch. That's what they do. But guess what? The framers also gave Congress 5 other jobs that they were supposed to carry out for the good of the country. Well, guess what? It's too much. There is no way that members of Congress, even working full out, can equally effectively carry out all 6 of their jobs all of the time. It is impossible. Congress has way too much to do. Now, if that's the case, and it is, if Congress has way too much to do, how do members of Congress prioritize their time? How do members of Congress decide, well, okay, we have 6 jobs that we're supposed to do. We can't do them all equally well all of the time. So which jobs do I focus my attention and my time and my energy on? And which ones do I spend a little bit less time dealing with? How do they figure that out? How do they make that prioritization of their time and their schedules? I talk about that in section 2, and it's really important. Pretty much every member of Congress prioritizes their time and the functions they carry out in the same way. And I lay it out there in section 2. Here it is basically. They prioritize their time based on their reelection obsession. In other words, members of Congress will spend the most time and effort and energy carrying out those 6 jobs that give them the best reelection benefit. They will spend most of their time doing those jobs that will help them get reelected again and again and again and again, which means that they spend most of their time carrying out about 3 of the 6 functions that you'll see talked about later on in the notes. And the other functions, the ones that either don't help them get reelected or the ones that might potentially harm their reelection chances, those are the ones that they kind of push off to the side, sort of push off into the corner and hope that nobody notices, okay? Now, that's a really important piece for us to understand, that members of Congress only tend to do those things that help them get reelected. And that is of real mixed benefit for us as folks living in the United States. Because here's the thing. Guess what? Those 3 functions that members of Congress do emphasize because it helps them get reelected, normally those 3 things are very good for the American people. They make us better off. So that's a good thing. But here's the problem. Those other 3 functions that they will sometimes de-emphasize because they don't help them get reelected or might actually hurt their reelection chances, those functions are things that should be done that provide the American people with benefits as well. So it's a real mixed bag. When Congress acts based on their reelection obsession, they do some things that benefit we the people, but they don't do other things that could benefit we the people. Okay? So those are the main pieces that I want you to really take away from a more detailed reading of the notes on Congress. Does that make sense? Any questions about that or anything that we've said specifically today about Congress in particular, or about the relationship amongst the three national government branches in general? Any questions, comments, problems about any of that stuff? No, we're good. All right, so let me quickly wrap things up. I apologize for taking you 5 minutes over. I appreciate your indulgence with me. So remember, this Thursday, not counting the 3-day grace period, of course, that's tacked on as well. But test number 2 is due to be submitted to me via Canvas this Thursday, I should say, at 11:59 p.m. If you have questions about test number 2, send me an email, send me a Canvas message. Jump on my virtual student hours tomorrow afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30 in the p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Do whatever you need to do to get your test questions answered. Our next class meeting here on Zoom will be next Tuesday at 11 o'clock. And we will be, I will deal with any questions that you have left over from your study of Congress. I'll then preview the next set of class notes and the next discussion forum post assignment dealing with the presidency, and of course, deal with any other questions that you have. So until then, remember, we are all going to get through this class successfully, and we are all going to get through this general crisis that we are facing successfully, because we are not alone. We are all in this together. Please never hesitate to reach out to me if there is anything that I can help you out with, whether it has to do with this class or just any other aspect of your life. You are not alone. I'm here for you. I'm here to help. I've got your back. All right. So take care, be well, be safe, and I'll see you all soon. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good one.
You
Hi,
too.
Professor.
Bye-bye.